Hello, we're back, and in this video lecture, we're going to talk about ICD-10 PCS procedures for the eye. These procedures, again, as you might expect, fall for the most part in the medical surgical section. So they start with 0 and 8, and then they have 5 characters. And the important thing to bear in mind is for this section, you need to understand what the root operations are. And these are in table 10.1 that you'll see. And they're things like alteration, bypass, change, destruction, dilation, drainage, extraction, occlusion, reattachment, repair, replacement, supplement, restriction, transfer, and so on. You may want to have that appendix with root operations marked with a post-it note so you can feel where it is and go right to it as needed. The body part involved is not merely just the eye, it's exactly where in the eye. And sometimes for people that are a little rusty on their anatomy and physiology and the terms of the eye, this can be confusing. Table 10.2 will describe this, and there's also a diagram in the code book as well. So you can dial in on whether it's the sclera, the cornea, the lens, the iris, the retina, or the retinal vessel, and so on. The approach, usually it could be one of these 5 choices. Open, in other words, we're doing some sort of open incision to get to the surgical site. It could be percutaneous. It could be via natural or artificial opening, using a scope, or external. In other words, we're cutting directly into the affected part. The 6th character will discuss whether a device remains in the patient's body after the procedure is over. And some of these devices include such things as drains, synthetic substitutes, intraocular telescopes, radioactive elements, infusion devices, visual prosthesis, extraluminal devices, and some of the other ones named here. Character 7 is a qualifier, which, as we know, qualifiers describe an additional attribute. In other chapters, they might be such things as whether a substance is ontologous, non-ontologous, what have you. But here we're going to talk about values for this 7th character, which is things like the sclera, the nasal cavity, whether something's diagnostic or there's no qualifier at all. Then lastly, procedures on the eye that are included in tables 080 through 08X. Some of these procedures will make a lot more sense to you if you can use your medical terminology knowledge and kind of figure out what they are. These are things like keratoplasties, the repair of the cornea, emulsification, the replacement of a intraocular lens, photocoagulation, and so on, right? Vitrectomy, right? Ectomy, removal, right? So if you understand what these terms are, it will make a lot more sense rather than just fumbling around the tables 080 through 08X. If you don't know what these things are, one of the things you may want to do is use a medical dictionary. There are a number of them online, including Dorland, Stedman's, and others. And that's all I have for you. We'll see you online. Please stop by office hours if you have any questions about this material. Bye now.